My name is Elena. I used to paint with light and water, coaxing worlds into being on stark white paper. My watercolors were my language, a way to speak of the gentle slant of afternoon sun on a cobblestone street, or the quiet melancholy of a misty morning over the Serena River. Now my hands, which once held brushes with such delicate certainty, tremble when I lift a teacup. The colors of my life have faded to muted grays, and my voice has become a stranger to me. I live in Viridian, a city of graceful, aging architecture and winding canals, a place where history breathes from the very stones. It was here, in a small gallery tucked away on a side street, that I met Dimitri. He was magnetic, his confidence a gravitational pull I couldn't resist. He spoke of ambition, of building an empire, of a future so bright it was blinding. I, a quiet artist who found solace in solitude, was swept away by his certainty. We married within a year. He bought us a beautiful apartment overlooking the river, with tall windows that were meant to flood my studio space with light. In the beginning, they did. I painted him, I painted our life, I painted the vibrant city that was our home. But the light began to dim, so gradually I barely noticed. It started with small things. A dismissive comment about a new painting, a suggestion that my hobby was a waste of time when I could be supporting his career. He worked at Apex Consolidated, a powerful investment firm, and his world of sharp suits and high-stakes deals began to eclipse my world of soft hues and quiet contemplation. Soon, the studio became his home office. The easels were folded away, the paints packed into boxes. He said it was temporary. But temporariness has a way of becoming permanent. His control was like a vine, slowly, silently wrapping around my life, choking the air from it until I could no longer remember what it felt like to breathe freely. The man who had promised me a world of light had instead built me a beautiful, gilded cage. And so, when my parents saw my face today, saw the ugly, violet blue stain blooming beneath my eye like a poisonous flower, they didn't ask a single question. Their silence was a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from threads of shock, pity, and a profound, unspoken sorrow. They stood in the doorway of our apartment, their figures etched against the hallway light, and then they turned and left without a word. Their footsteps, fading down the corridor, were the sound of my last hope receding. My husband, Dimitri, watched them go with a smirk of smug satisfaction. He sank into his favorite leather armchair, the one that dominated the living room like a throne, a bottle of imported beer clutched in his hand. His moment of triumph, however, was destined to be fleeting. Barely half an hour later, the sharp, decisive click of the lock turning in the door echoed through the apartment again. Elena? My name, spoken in my mother's voice, felt like a fragile whisper from a life I no longer lived. I opened the door, moving as if through water, my limbs heavy with a weariness that went bone deep. The bruise under my eye had darkened, a stark constellation of pain against my pale skin. My eyes, which Dimitri had once said held all the colors of the sea, now felt like two hollowed-out pits, mirroring nothing but exhaustion and a paralyzing fear. I had harbored a foolish, desperate hope that my parents might not have noticed the mark, that the dim lighting of the hallway might have concealed it. But I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that it was impossible to hide. There they stood, my mother, Irina, and my father, Mikhail, framed in the doorway like ghosts from a past I could barely recall, a time when our small family home was filled with laughter, when I wasn't afraid to take a full breath. My mother's lips were pressed into a thin, trembling line, as if she were physically restraining a cry of anguish. Her eyes, usually the warm brown of rich earth, were clouded with a desperate, helpless need to protect me. My father, always my pillar, my quiet strength, seemed diminished. His broad shoulders were slumped, his face etched with fine lines that seemed to have deepened in the last hour, making him look a decade older. His gaze flickered across my face, darting away from the bruise as if the sight of it physically burned him. They stepped inside, moving with a cautious uncertainty, as if navigating a minefield. Each footfall on the polished parquet floor seemed to reverberate in the oppressive silence, amplifying the tension that clung to the air like a damp fog. Dmitri, still sprawled in his armchair, exuded an aura of arrogant ownership. He curled his fingers around the neck of his beer bottle, a mocking grin spreading across his face as he sized up my parents. "Well, well. Come in, dear guests," he drawled, his voice deliberately loud, dripping with a cloying, sarcastic welcome. His eyes, a sharp, piercing blue, gleamed with a cruel sense of victory. To him, their silent, sorrowful presence was not a condemnation of his actions, but proof of his dominion over me. It was a silent acknowledgement that even my own parents were powerless against him. A cold shiver snaked down my spine, my stomach twisting into a tight knot of shame. I wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the floorboards and escape the weight of their pity and his venom. My eyes fell to the floor, to the intricate pattern of the Persian rug we'd bought on our honeymoon, a trip that now felt like a scene from someone else's life. I focused on the threads, desperate to hide the tears that threatened to spill over, each one a liquid confession of my failure and despair. Irina, my mother, summoned a fragile-looking courage and moved towards the kitchen. Her steps were deliberate but unsteady, as if she were concentrating on the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other. Mikhail, my father, lingered in the hallway, his hesitation palpable. It felt as though crossing the threshold into the living room, into the space dominated by Dmitri, would be to fully admit the nightmare was real. "I'll put the kettle on," Mama murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She set the sleek, stainless steel kettle on the stove with hands that trembled, a tremor that betrayed her forced composure. I saw the glint of a tear as she quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture so subtle yet so heavy with the grief she was trying to contain. The kitchen became a small, brightly lit stage for our unspoken agony. The only sounds were the soft gurgle of the heating water and the relentless, metronomic ticking of the designer clock on the wall, each second stretching into an eternity. I sat at the small kitchen table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. I couldn't bring myself to meet my parents' gazes. Dmitri leaned against the doorframe, his presence looming over us, a predator savoring the discomfort of his cornered prey. He watched us with a twisted, detached amusement, relishing my parents' helplessness and the silent judgment in their eyes. The tea was poured, its fragrant steam rising from the delicate porcelain cups Mama had set on the table with such care. They were part of a set I'd inherited from my grandmother, cups I had always loved. Now, they seemed like props in a tragic play. No one reached for them. They sat untouched, silent witnesses to our fractured family, the warm liquid slowly growing cold. A lump rose in my throat, a scream trapped in my chest, begging for release. I wanted to tell them everything, the years of simmering fear, the bruises hidden under long-sleeved blouses, the nights spent curled into a tight ball, praying for morning. But fear held me captive, its cold fingers wrapped around my throat, choking the words before they could form. I was terrified of Dmitri, of the swift and brutal retribution that would follow if I dared to speak. My father finally broke the suffocating silence with a forced cough, his voice strained and unnaturally loud. How's work at the gallery, Elena?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the floral pattern of the tablecloth, unable to meet mine. "Fine," I whispered, the word a tiny puff of air. The gallery had let me go months ago, my attendance having become too erratic, my focus shattered. Dmitri had called it a blessing. And Dmitri? How are things at Apex? Papa faltered, grasping for any semblance of normality in a moment that was anything but. "Everything's fine, Papa," I replied, feeling the hot prick of tears behind my eyes again. Dmitri let out a short, derisive snort from the doorway. "Couldn't be better," he said, his smirk widening into a grin. There was a clear challenge in his tone, a dare for them to contradict him. I saw a flicker of fire in my mother's eyes, a protective instinct warring with her ingrained fear. She bit her lip, holding back the words I knew were burning her tongue, understanding that one wrong move could ignite Dimitri's volatile temper. Time crawled by, each minute an exercise in torment. We were all trapped in our own private prisons of thought, drowning in the crushing weight of everything left unsaid. I felt like one of the birds I used to paint, a creature meant for the open sky, now trapped in a cage, my wings clipped by fear and despair. Seeing the raw pain on my parents' faces and knowing they were seeing mine cut deeper than any physical blow. I finally understood that their silence wasn't born of indifference, but of a paralyzing fear, a fear not just for me, but for themselves, for what a direct confrontation with Dimitri might unleash. At last, my father stood up, his movements heavy with a defeated resolve. "We should be going, Irina," he said, his voice flat. She nodded immediately, her shoulders sagging with a visible relief, as if escaping the apartment offered a temporary reprieve from a pain too great to bear. They bid me a quiet farewell at the door, their eyes still avoiding mine, as if looking at me for too long would shatter their fragile composure. Mama pulled me into a tight, trembling embrace. "Stay strong, my darling," she whispered into my ear, her voice cracking with suppressed emotion. "Be strong." My father gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, his face a mask of unreadable emotion, and then he turned and walked away. I watched them go, my heart sinking like a stone into a deep, cold well. Their visit hadn't changed anything. I was still alone, left to face my fear in the suffocating silence of this beautiful, empty apartment. As the door clicked shut, sealing me back inside my prison, Dimitri walked towards me, his sneer cutting through the quiet. "Well, that's that," he said, his voice soft, almost conversational, which was somehow more chilling than his anger. "Even your precious parents know when to keep their mouths shut. What have I always told you, Lena? Just take it. Nobody wants a broken thing." His words were a familiar poison, a knife twisting in a wound that never healed. I stood frozen, staring at the closed door, the grain of the dark wood swimming before my eyes. But then, something inside me, something I thought had died long ago, fractured. The invisible chain that had bound me to him, to this life of silent submission, didn't just break, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. In the place where fear had lived for so long, a tiny, unfamiliar spark of anger ignited, a white-hot anger at him, at myself, and at a world that had taught me to be quiet and accommodating. I locked the door, the bolt sliding home with a solid, final thud. I leaned against the cold wood, the tears finally streaming down my cheeks. But these were not the hot, panicked tears of fear I had cried for years. These were tears of rage, of defiance, of a cold, clear resolve I didn't know I possessed. I was done staying silent. I was done enduring. I was going to break free. I had to. Dimitri, oblivious, was basking in his perceived victory. He had retrieved the remote and flicked on the large television, the jarringly loud theme of a financial news program filling the room, a stark contrast to the quiet, seismic shift happening inside me. He sank back into his leather chair, sipping his beer with a smug, self-satisfied grin, a conquering hero in his own private war. "See," he taunted, not even bothering to look at me. "Even your sainted mother and father can't do a thing. So just sit down and stop looking so tragic. It's boring." I turned my back on him and walked to the tall windows overlooking the Serena River. The late autumn drizzle had begun, blurring the city lights into soft, impressionistic strokes of color against the deepening twilight. The rain-streaked glass mirrored the haze in my own mind. Usually, moments like this, after a confrontation, would drown me in a tidal wave of terror, stripping away any last vestige of my will to fight back. But today was different. It wasn't a dramatic explosion of courage. It was a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion, an exhaustion from the constant performance of being fine, from swallowing his lies, from shrinking myself down to fit into the small, suffocating space he allowed me. The fragile thread that had tethered me to this life of suffering had finally snapped, and in its place was a strange, hollowed-out sense of liberation, like a rusty lock finally giving way. Meanwhile, my parents' car was speeding through the rain-slicked streets of Viridian, heading towards the suburbs where my brother, Alexei, lived. The silence inside their car was heavy, broken only by my mother's stifled sobs. My father gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, his face pale and gray with a mixture of guilt and despair. They were both carrying the crushing weight of their inaction, of the years they had looked away, convincing themselves it was just a difficult patch, hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. Mama fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She opened the photo gallery, her thumb hovering over a hidden album. It contained a handful of photos she'd taken in secret during previous visits, a fading bruise on my arm from a time I'd claimed I'd walked into a door, the shadow of scratches on my neck I'd hidden with a scarf. This new one of my face was the most damning. These images were more powerful than any words could be, raw, undeniable evidence of the truth they had tried so hard to avoid. She held the phone out to my father. "Look, Misha. Just look at what he's done to her," she whispered, her voice breaking, heavy with self-reproach. "And we did nothing. We just sat there and drank tea." My father glanced at the illuminated screen for a fraction of a second before turning away, his jaw tight. He couldn't bear to look at it. He had always prided himself on being a good father, a protector. Now he saw his silence for what it was, a betrayal. "We should have done something years ago, Irina," he said, his voice thick with a regret so profound it was almost a physical thing. Years ago. They reached my brother's apartment building, a modern, unassuming structure, and hurried up the 3 flights of stairs. When Alexei opened the door to their frantic knocking and saw their tear-streaked, ashen faces, he knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. "What happened? Is it Lena?" he demanded, his voice sharp with a brother's protective instinct. My mother simply handed him the phone. Alexei, a pragmatic and decisive man who ran his own successful software company, took it, his expression hardening as he swiped through the photos. His face, usually open and quick to smile, darkened into a thunderous mask of fury. "This ends," he said, his voice a low growl. He set the phone down on the entryway table with a sharp thud. "This ends right now. I'm calling the police." He dialed 112 without a moment's hesitation. His voice was calm, almost unnaturally so, but firm and resolute as he reported an incident of domestic violence. He gave my address, Dimitri's full name, and a concise summary of the situation with the cool precision of a man accustomed to solving complex problems. Then, he began gathering his things, his jacket, his keys. "I'm going over there," he told our parents. "I need to make sure she's safe." Alexei understood the system, the loopholes, the ways a man like Dimitri, charming, wealthy, well-connected, could talk his way out of trouble. He knew that if they didn't act with overwhelming force and clarity, this moment could be lost. Protecting me was his only priority. I was still standing by the window, lost in the swirling patterns of the rain, when my phone, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, began to buzz. It was an unknown number. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hesitated, then, propelled by some new, unknown impulse, I walked over and answered it. "Lena, it's Alexei." My brother's voice, steady and urgent, cut through the fog in my head. I flinched, startled. We weren't estranged, but our lives had drifted apart. He'd never approved of Dimitri. "Alexei? What's wrong?" "I know what's happening, Lena. Mom and Dad are here. They told me everything. I've called the police. They're on their way to you right now." The word police sent a jolt of pure, undiluted fear through me. For years, the police represented chaos, the ultimate escalation, the very thing I had contorted my life to avoid. But Alexei's voice was an anchor, its strength pushing back the rising tide of panic. "Are you sure?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Is that the right thing to do?" "Lena, listen to me," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. You do not have to live like this. You deserve a life, a real one, without fear. You deserve to pick up a paintbrush again. Are you ready to get out of this? His words, especially the mention of my painting, sliced through the years of Dimitri's insidious brainwashing, his constant refrain of "no one needs you. Where would you even go?" Alexei's voice was the shattering counterargument. Someone needed me. Someone was fighting for me. A single, silent tear traced a path down my cheek. "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible, but resolute. "Yes, I'm ready." "Good," he replied, a hint of relief in his voice. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Just wait for me. And don't be afraid. I'm with you." I hung up the phone, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me: fear, yes, but also a fragile, burgeoning hope and the lingering, cleansing fire of my anger. But one clear, shining truth cut through the chaos: I wasn't alone anymore. I had a lifeline. It gave me the strength to take the next step. I glanced at Dimitri. He was still engrossed in his program, his face relaxed and smug in the flickering blue light of the screen. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the world he had so meticulously constructed around himself was about to collapse. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I walked into our bedroom. My steps felt purposeful for the first time in years. I opened the wardrobe and pulled down a small suitcase from the top shelf. I had no grand plan, only the immediate goal of staying with my parents for a few days. I packed with a strange, detached clarity. A few simple dresses, my favorite worn-in jeans, a handful of old photographs of my parents and Alexei from a time when we were all happy. And, from the bottom of my drawer, I retrieved an old, plush rabbit, its fur worn smooth from years of childhood affection. It was a tangible piece of a life before Dimitri, a life where I had known what it felt like to be safe and cherished. An hour and a half after my parents had first left, the lock on the front door clicked again. Dimitri, still lounging on the couch, stiffened. His smug demeanor faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Who did you call now?" he snarled, his eyes still on the television, but his voice laced with a new, creeping unease. The door swung open, and there stood Alexei, his face set and serious. He was flanked by 2 uniformed police officers and a third, older man in a slightly different uniform, the local precinct officer. Behind them, hovering in the hallway like a lost soul, was my father, his face ashen, looking as if he himself were the one bearing the weight of a terrible crime. I stood to one side, leaning against the wall for support, clutching a thin manila folder to my chest. It contained my truth. The fear that had been my constant companion for years had dissolved, replaced by a cold, steady calm. I knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult road, but it was the start of something new, a life where I was allowed to speak, where my voice mattered. Alexei stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "Dmitri Volkov," he asked, his voice even and authoritative, the tone of a man who was absolutely certain of his ground. Dmitri muted the TV, tossing the remote onto the coffee table with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. "What's this circus about?" he snapped, trying to project his usual bravado, but his eyes darted nervously between the officers, betraying his growing panic. "You're being detained on suspicion of causing bodily harm to your wife," Elena Rostova, one of the younger officers, began, reading from a formal document. Dmitri shot to his feet, his face contorting in disbelief. "Detained? This is ridiculous. She's clumsy. She did this to herself. You're going to believe her." His gaze swung to me, a wild, desperate look in his eyes. "Lena, what is this game? Tell them. You know I didn't mean it. It was an accident." I said nothing. My silence, for so long a symbol of my submission, was now my greatest strength. I simply held out the folder to Alexei, who passed it to the precinct officer. Statements from prior incidents, photographs, copies of medical records. "Everything is documented," Alexei said, his voice calm but unyielding. The officer opened the folder and began to review its contents, his expression growing grim. He nodded to my father, who stepped forward like a man in a trance, confirming his identity as a witness to my injury earlier that evening. Dmitri began to pace the room like a trapped animal, his voice rising in pitch. "You're all insane. On what grounds? This is my home." He took a step toward me, a threatening lunge, but Alexei moved instantly, blocking his path. "Stay away from her," Alexei warned, his voice low and menacing. "You'll have your chance to explain everything down at the station." The two officers moved in, seizing Dmitri by the arms. He thrashed, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is a threat. I'll sue you all. I have connections. You have no idea who you're dealing with. You'll all regret this." My father stood with his head bowed, unable to meet my eyes. He was watching the destruction of the man he had once welcomed into his family, the man to whom he had entrusted his only daughter. The weight of his guilt, his years of cowardly inaction, was crushing him. I watched as they led Dmitri away, his final, hate-filled glare directed at me. I flinched, an old, conditioned reflex, but the fear didn't take hold. For the first time, I felt safe, surrounded by people who would not let me fall. Once the door closed behind them, a profound quiet descended on the apartment. "Lena," Alexei said, turning to me, his voice gentle now. "You need to get a full medical examination and have them document everything officially. Mom will go with you." I nodded, still dazed by the whirlwind of the last few hours. My mother, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward and wrapped me in a warm, solid embrace. "It's going to be okay now, my darling," she whispered, her voice trembling but filled with a tenderness I hadn't felt from her in years. My father remained in the hallway, staring at the closed door as if he could still see the ghosts of what had just transpired. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to say all the things he should have said years ago, but the words wouldn't come. Mama and I left for the hospital, the taxi ride shrouded in a heavy silence, punctuated only by her quiet, cleansing sobs. I stared out at the blurred lights of Viridian, feeling both hollowed out and strangely, wonderfully light. For the first time in a very long time, I could glimpse the possibility of a future that was not defined by fear. At the hospital, a kind, thorough doctor documented every injury, each bruise and scratch a formal testament to my survival. Mama never left my side, her hand a warm, constant pressure on mine, her whispered words of encouragement a lifeline in the sterile, impersonal environment. When we returned to the apartment, Alexei was at the dining table, already drafting an application for a restraining order, his laptop glowing in the dim light. My father was in the kitchen, silently sipping a cup of tea, his hands unsteady. I saw the tear tracks on my mother's cheeks as she moved to join him, putting on the kettle again, the familiar ritual now a source of comfort instead of tension. "Mama, please don't cry," I said softly, going to her and wrapping my arms around her. "It's over. We'll be okay." "I know, sweetheart," she replied, wiping her eyes. I'm so relieved you're free of him. I knew, Lena. In my heart, I knew he was hurting you. But I was so afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of making things worse for you if we interfered." "I know, Mama," I said, and I truly did. "But it's over. We're going to live differently now." While we spoke, my father had begun to move through the apartment with a quiet, solemn purpose. He was gathering Dmitri's things, his expensive clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of pretentious business books, and packing them into large black trash bags. He worked in complete silence, each trip out to the buildings landing a small, physical act of atonement for his years of looking away. I sat in my old room, which had been used for storage for years, surrounded by the warmth of my family. Alexei explained the legal steps that lay ahead, his voice a steady, reassuring presence. My mother stroked my hair, her touch gentle, her words a soft murmur of love and support. My father remained in the kitchen, the guilt still etched on his face, but he was present, he was helping, he was here. Looking at them, my mother, my father, my brother, I saw not just their flaws and their past failures, but their love, their support, and a glimmer of hope for our collective future. I was not a broken thing. I was not alone. I had a family that loved me, a family that would stand by me, no matter what. The apartment was cloaked in an unfamiliar quiet. The television, which had been the constant, aggressive soundtrack to my life with Dimitri, was dark and silent. The silence was no longer oppressive and threatening. It was peaceful, like the air after a storm. It was both jarring and deeply comforting. The absence of a grating noise I hadn't realized was so constant until it was gone. Something intangible lingered in the air, a fragile sense of freedom, not yet fully realized, but undeniably present. Mama moved about the kitchen with a newfound steadiness, her hands no longer trembling as she set out the old porcelain cups. It was as if she, too, had shed a crushing weight. Her presence was grounding, a quiet anchor in the shifting currents of my new reality. Alexei was still at the table, immersed in legal documents, but he looked up as I entered the room, his smile warm and unwavering. I turned away for a moment, busying myself by looking out the window at the now empty street, hiding the tears that welled up in my eyes. I didn't want him to see my vulnerability, not yet. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, setting his papers aside and giving me his full attention. "Okay," I murmured, sliding into the chair across from him. "It all feels unreal. Like I'm going to wake up and he'll be here." "This is real, Lena," he said, his voice firm, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. His touch was warm and strong. "This is the first day of the rest of your life, and you don't have to do any of it alone." I looked at his hand covering mine, then up at his earnest, determined face. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I believed him. The path ahead was uncertain, shrouded in mist like the river on a winter morning, but for the first time, I felt I had the strength to walk it. The light in my apartment was dim, but it was a soft, gentle light, full of promise. And I knew, with a quiet, growing certainty, that one day soon, I would pick up my brushes again.